my session here. My name is Todd Bursch. I'm a consulting SE for WebSense. At least that's where I'm at currently. Over the past 16 years, I've worked at every major vendor in the upper right-hand quadrant for web security. So McAfee, Cisco, Blue Coat, all those guys. I am using the WebSense slide deck, but this is a vendor-agnostic presentation, so I'm not going to do any product demos. It's not going to be extremely low levels. There's going to be, like I said, no demos just because connectivity, things like this. But what I am going to do is talk about threat modeling and how to approach, take it from the approach of the attacker-centric version and proper ways to identify the different steps and then proper methods for doing mitigation as well. And this is going to take kind of a holistic approach to covering both technology as well as processes and people as well. So how many people are familiar with the 7 stage of the kill chain? Okay, good number. This is basically, it's a number of steps that typical attacks will take. They don't necessarily go in the straight order. They're not necessarily going to go through all 7 steps. But the main point is that if you are able to disrupt one of these links along the process, you have a much better chance of stopping that particular threat. And I'm based out of Minneapolis, so Target's in my backyard. I like to use them as an example of what happened in that particular attack and kind of what went wrong from a process, people, and technology standpoint as well. And all of the slides here, I have a PDF version available with annotated links at the back end of it. So if anybody's interested, you can stop by the WebSense booth, or my email address is on the back of it, or come see me after, whatever, either way. So the very first stage is the GrrCON stage. And there's 2 types of recon. There's passive and active. Passive, the unfortunate thing, this first stage is the hardest one to protect yourself against because it's data that's out there that everybody has access to. One of the tools that's used quite often for this is LinkedIn. So I was actually able to predict the future using LinkedIn. I was working at a security firm. I had links with people in the engineering team, and I noticed they were all getting new links to engineers with one of our competitors. And then a month later, we announced the acquisition of that company that all of them had linked to during that time frame. So there's a lot of information that's outside of your control, that's in the public domain, that you have to be aware of because that information can potentially be used against you. In the case of the actual target breach, the recon stage was literally going in and attacking a third party and taking over their services to gain access into a target service. So it was a third-party heating and ventilation company. Target had a portal that was publicly accessible that lists all of their vendors that they did business with. So in this particular attack, they picked out a specific vendor, went after that vendor, was able to gain control of their network, loaded in some password capturing information, keyloggers, and were able to use the credentials from that third party to gain access into a Target CRM service. So in the case of reconning for the target breach, this involved an entirely another breach of a different organization as their first step to getting a foothold within Target's organization. So that would be considered active recon. So the best methods for mitigating those types of attacks, like I said, you want to figure out what's going on outside of your network, what information is available about you, your links, other organizations you work with. In the case of Target, one of the good steps that would have helped with this would have been something like 2-factor authentication for access to that CRM third-party portal. So the lure piece. So this is where, you give you some sort of information. This is typically phishing email, things like that. It's usually pretty straightforward. I've been with WebSense for about a year. When I started there, this is a high-security company. I went through the onboarding process, and I kept on getting all of these emails for payroll and for Salesforce.com and things like this, and a lot of these were all federated, so they were using all I had to do was use my network credentials. So I'm getting all these emails asking me to click on this link and log in using my Active Directory credentials. So even working for a high-security company with a security background, I was getting tons of emails as part of my normal process that looked like phishing. So I had to go back and email IT and HR and said, is this something you do to your new hires to see if they're stupid enough to click on it, or is this really an actual process? In the previous presentation, there was the Dilbert cartoon, the techies didn't click on it, but the pointy-haired boss did. Well, even with the people who know what phishing looks like, it's still very hard to discern without double-checking with the source. In the case of watering holes, there was the massive NBC watering hole leak where you went to their site and through a third-party advertising link, they actually hosted malware. There was also one Chinese takeout. So there's a exploit that was targeting a specific oil and gas company on the East Coast. They couldn't attack the company directly, so what they did is they found a Chinese restaurant nearby that lots of the employees went to eat at, and they took over the GoDaddy website or whatever they're using to host it, and had malware implanted in their PDF menu. So when the employees from the oil and gas company downloaded the menu from that restaurant next to their office, they used that as a method to gain access into the network. So recommendations from a lure standpoint, people, process, and technology. So user education is usually your best bet against phishing. But like I said, even if you have technically savvy people that are aware of what looks like phishing, misspellings, you hover over the link and it goes to an .ru domain, things like that, those are ones that are pretty easy to detect. However, there's a lot more complex threats out there that even, people who have been doing this for a long time can sometimes trip up and click on the wrong link. And all it takes is one link, and then you are owned from that point on. So user education, real-time threat analysis, and your typical anti-spam, anti-phishing. And you want to do active URL scanning and wrapping. The reason for that is that a lot of these phishing emails, what will happen is when you're doing a campaign, they'll send out an email late Friday that contains a link. Your anti-spam gateway will do a real-time scan of that link. It'll come up as benign. However, Sunday night, whoever is running this campaign will actually go in and flip whatever content is on that link from benign to active malicious. So when your employees come in Monday, they get that email, they click on the link, what was scanned by your email gateway as benign is now live active malware. So you want to look at email technologies that do URL wrapping, and you want to make sure that you're doing active scanning on those links that get clicked as well. So the redirect stage, this is the one that often gets skipped. However, it does come in handy sometimes. So WebSense Lab, we've actually looked at the number of links that you typically get bounced around from as far as that initial URL that you click on to where you actually wind up when the page renders. Somewhere between 4 and 20 URLs, what we found from our lab's research. In the case of NBC.com, it was a one-line iframe, triggered a JavaScript, redirected to 2 more files, and then there was a couple other exploits that would potentially trigger depending on what they were doing, and it ultimately delivered the Citadel Trojan. That Citadel Trojan was a remote access keylogger. That was the same malware that was implanted on that HVAC company that was owned as part of the target breach. And this is an example from our labs. Basically, we went in and we did a replay back of that specific NBC attack, and you see you got the lure up at the top there. There's the exploit kit where they're probing the endpoint for what type of OS and Java and things that they're running. Then there's some actual exploit code put down, and then the dropper file as far as being able to phone home and do the command and control and all of that. So it's typically a multi-stage process. Recommendations as far as protection against the redirect link. You want to look at the full redirect path. Like I said, a lot of times you're bouncing around back and forth. You can't rely on static URL databases anymore. So if you're doing URL scanning on your firewall, one of those good enough checkboxes on your next-gen firewall, that's not going to cut it anymore. You need to do active scanning of the URLs and the content that's coming down. Typically, you want to work with some sort of signature-less, real-time analytics that's going to be scanning that content as it's going by. So the exploit kit. This is the actual code that's resident on the web server that's going to do some probing to figure out, okay, what are you vulnerable? What vulnerabilities do you have in your platform, and what tools do I have that I can leverage against that? And the nice thing about the the exploit kits is that it lets you save your 0 days, keep it in your back pocket for something that's really juicy. This is going to tell you the lowest common denominator as far as what it's going to take over that particular endpoint. And these exploit kits you can buy online for $300-400. I mean, even somebody like Angelina Jolie could actually download one of those tools, put it on a web server, and use it to gain access to your system. So recommendations on the exploit kit. You definitely want to obviously patch, reduce your exposure, dynamic real-time defenses. One of the things about this is that if you're in the medical field, you have your infusion pumps that are running some custom version of Windows. You can't actually touch the OS. It's probably XP or something. In the case of Target, their point-of-sale systems were running XP with some custom software on there. So they were probably running some whitelist application services, things like that. But in their particular case, maybe they took over the server that actually pushed down the rule sets as far as what was being whitelisted, things like that. There's a lot of those devices out there in production and manufacturing that you can't patch or touch, because if you did, you stand the chance of breaking it and having your entire production floor shut down. So there's a lot of these legacy machines all over your network that once somebody uses one of those to gain a foothold, then they have leverage and they can use that to branch out in the rest of the network. Within the Target breach, they found several machines within the network that hosted password crackers and network scanning tools and things like that. So they literally had a couple of owned machines within the network that they used as a jump-off point to go in and scan the rest of the Target network and branch out from there. In the case of those POS machines, point of sale, as part of PCI compliance, they have to be on a separate network. So they didn't attack them directly. They got a foothold within the network and then used that to jump into the next stage and take over the other machines. So from a defenses standpoint, your typical IDS, IPS, and you want to work with the endpoint as well. With the endpoint, the CEO of Symantec said that antivirus is dead. It's still one of your layers of defense in your belt and suspenders. You can't get away without having it, but it's definitely something you need. In the case of that HVAC company, they were using Malwarebytes, the free version, on their workstations. That was pretty much the only protection they had. So you're at the mercy of your vendors and your partners as far as protecting all of those chains along the exploit there. So the dropper file, this is the actual code that gets planted onto the victim PC, workstation, whatever. These you can buy as well online. These will run you a couple $1,000. Pretty straightforward. You can modify them. Sometimes you can get the source code for them. There are single stage ones that actually have the payload. There's also multi-stage where basically just put down a little dropper and then it'll ping home and then it'll pull down the modules that it needs to go along with it. So one of the common things that you'd use from a defense of this would be the sandboxing. So in the case of Target, they had Symantec endpoint deployed everywhere. They also had a fairly recent deployment of FireEye as well. And what's interesting, there's a timeline at the end of this slide deck as far as how things occurred within Target. The dropper files were on their network, and the attacker had remote access within Target for 2 weeks before they noticed, before any alerts started showing up within the FireEye and the Symantec. FireEye and Symantec started throwing off alerts pretty much at the same time, but by then they had already planted the malware on the point-of-sale machines and basically had full access to the internal network. One of the things that the attackers are doing to evade this is they're actually now doing sandbox detection. So they're letting the malicious code be stay dormant for a while. They're detecting whether or not they're running in a virtual environment. So it's a continual cat and mouse game here as far as being able to try and stay one step ahead of them. And from a recommendation standpoint, from a dropper file, it's a layer defense. Sandboxing, antivirus, anti-malware, like I said, both of these were in place with Target. One of the places that they kind of fell down with this is that while FireEye was in place, as was Symantec. With the FireEye, they were getting tons of alerts, all kinds of alerts. Not necessarily false positives, but they were getting more alerts than they knew what to do with. They didn't have any process in place to handle them and do something with the alerts. The alerts were being monitored by contractors in Asia Pacific. So they kind of outsourced their frontline defense as far as the monitoring of the information that they were getting from FireEye. And then when they came back to the US, as far as we got all this stuff going on, like I said, there wasn't a process in place. The malware stayed on their network for over a week after they were getting the alerts from both Symantec and from FireEye. So these are known pieces of malware that they were finding, they were getting, put it around on the network. And typically, the interesting thing about this, that those files being on their network for, a couple of weeks before these were triggered, there have been, rumors about potential insider assistance on this, things like that. How did they make the transition from the CRM portal to the internal network? While that kind of remains a gray area, the insider threat was probably not a big play there, because if they were, it would have been much easier for them to handle the data exfiltration than what they did in this particular process. So you're still going to need these. These utilities are still excellent, things you need to deploy, but you need the process in place to be able to handle those types of alerts and act on them. So like I said, it was a fairly new deployment of FireEye. They weren't quite sure, what to do with it, but the remediation piece of it wasn't there. They were getting alerts. The alerts were a little late. They didn't act on them. They got owned. So the call home, once you've got that code on the target network, basically you need to do something with that. You need to be able to communicate with that piece of malicious software that you planted on the target network, and then you need to tell it what to do. So basically they're going to use some method. It could be DNS, it could be ICMP, it could be HTTP, it could be HTTPS, whatever, some method for pinging back to some host or IRC chat and getting some sort of commands as far as what the next steps are to take. With Mevade, this was a pretty interesting one. Our labs group saw a huge uptick at the end of last year in Tor activity, the Onion Router. So the Onion Router is a way to anonymously surf the internet. It's all encrypted. You jump through multiple endpoints. You don't actually see who the client connection is actually coming from. There's methods to track that down if you haven't deployed it correctly. But initially we thought that the upswing in Tor was because of the Snowden leaks. So everybody got smart and figured that the NSA was listening to everything they're doing, so people started actually using Tor to evade all of the monitors going in place. Turns out it was a specific piece of malware called Mevade, and what it did is it dropped in a little mini Tor client, and it used that to connect back to its command and control center. And in addition to tunneling out, it also created a remote access tunnel back to that workstation. So it used anonymous proxy HTTPS connections to get out to the internet, and then it gave the attacker a remote access tunnel back to that workstation. So they basically owned that workstation, had full keyboard, mouse control of that box. In that particular case, this is a map from our labs group. All of the blue diagrams show where we pinpointed specific attacks with Mevade. The two reds in Ukraine and Russia, those were where the command and control centers actually were resident. And this particular attack targeted financial and business and government entities specifically. So best recommendation from a remediation standpoint, scan and monitor all of your outbound traffic. You have to do SSL and HTTPS inspection. You cannot be blind to HTTPS anymore because everything is getting tunneled over encrypted channels. Everything you do within the Google realm is encrypted. Everything you do, Yahoo and Gmail, you have to have visibility into that. And the reason is twofold. One is you need to make sure that you're not downloading malicious content over those encrypted channels, and two is you want to make sure that data is not leaking out, either command and control data, or it could be PII, PHI, PCI, any sort of regulatory compliance or proprietary information getting leaked out through those channels as well. Yeah, since I work in the web security space, we've seen a major upswing in the use of HTTPS. I mean, typically, several years ago, it would be 20-30% maybe of HTTPS versus HTTP. Since Google went full HTTPS everywhere, and with the explosion of Office 365 and Google Apps, we're seeing customers now up in the 40-60% range as far as all of their web traffic that's going out to the internet is now HTTPS encrypted. So this is usually the least common denominator as far as the best way to tunnel stuff out of a network. Because there's still a lot of legacy customers out there that are using, that good enough 1.0 web filtering, category-based access control. They're not doing any actual inspection of the content, and if they are, they're not doing the HTTPS inspection. HTTPS inspection is difficult. It costs cycles both from a CPU standpoint and from administrative headaches as well, having to deal with the certificates. But we're at the point in time today where you can't get away with not doing full HTTPS inspection of your outbound traffic. So IDS, IPS, next-gen firewall, botnet detection. One of the things I thought was very interesting in doing all the research on the target exploit is when people were talking, specific researchers and things were talking about best ways to mitigate all of the threats and attacks like that. Firewalls, next-gen firewalls, did not ever really pop up in any of those discussions. They were all talking about more internal type solutions, whether it's IDS, IPS, full-blown mail gateways, web security gateways, things like that, network logging, monitoring. Firewalls was just kind of given that those are not going to be your best line of defense for these types of attacks. So data theft. This is the data exfiltration component, and this is the most dangerous. And as far as target's concerned, this is where they really dropped the ball. This one was just, I don't know how they could have gotten away with as far as what happened to them in this particular instance. So basically, data theft is getting that data off the network. With Target specifically, there was 11 gigs worth of data that was FTP'd off of their network. Now, the guy that wrote this, or the person who wrote this, was actually fairly smart. They staged it. They put the information on internal servers, SMB servers that they'd taken over, and then they scheduled it to run once an hour between 10 a.m. and 5 p.m. Central Time, so it looked like normal work traffic. But literally, it was base 64 encoded track 1, track 2 credit card information sent in clear FTP off to a couple of staging servers in the US, where it then got shuttled over to Eastern Europe. So just regular FTP, 11 gigs worth of credit card information sent across the network in less than 2 weeks. So like I mentioned earlier, encryption is becoming much more common in these types of attacks as far as getting data off your network. You cannot be blind to those types of communication channels anymore. You have to do full-blown inspection of your encrypted traffic. You also need to be able to detect custom encrypted files. So there's lots of people that are using PGP and WinZip and things like that for the encryption, but you need to be able to identify content that's getting sent off your network that is not using a common encryption format, because those are often the ones like CryptoLocker that are using some other methods for trying to send that information off your network without you being able to actively scan it. So you need a full-blown detection utility that has the ability to determine this is an encrypted file that we don't have visibility into. And oftentimes, data exfiltration, it's not necessarily all that organized. It may just, happen through a backdoor, but a lot of times in the case of like Target, that data pretty much walked right out the front door. So from a remediation standpoint, you definitely want to secure the other 6 stages, but you need a full-blown, DTP, DLP, DSS type solution. You need to be able to inspect all of that outgoing information. You need to scan image files for content stored within them, as far as taking screenshots with your phone of a spreadsheet full of passwords, credit card information, whatever, sending it off via email. You also need to look for data drip detection as well. So maybe you have a rule that says you can't send an email with 10 credit card numbers in it. So what they'll do is they'll keep on sending them out email after email with 9. So you need to be able to, cumulatively look for that over a long period of time, and you have to do, SSL, TLS inspection as well. Like I mentioned before, not all of these steps are necessarily taken in order. Like I said, the redirect is typically one that's skipped most often. The insider threat, you notice that bypasses all the 6 first stages. your only point of detection is that data leaving your network, either via USB thumb drive, Gmail, Dropbox, whatever. That's your only protection for insider threat, is watching the data leave either your devices or your network. I'll skip over this one because we're running a little bit on time, but basically it's just kind of a step through as far as the POS scraper, the RAM scraper that was used on like the Target breach. So this is the timeline. Target actually had a PCI recertification in September, around the same time that the HVAC vendor was compromised. The first breach happened middle of November, and this is the roll-up right before Black Friday. So the first test of the POS malware happened literally 3 days after they gained access to the network. 2 weeks later, FireEye Symantec started firing off triggers as far as alerts to malicious content that was found on the network. And by that time, they had a full deployment of the POS RAM scrapers. And 2 days later, they started doing the data exfil via FTP. And about a week and a half later, the DOJ called them and said, you guys might have a problem. We're seeing all your credit card information is getting sent around on the internet. And then a couple of days after that, they confirmed the breach and actually locked down the network and cut them off. So by examining those 7 stages, looking at ways to mitigate them, you can prevent your company from being in my next presentation. And this is something that the WebSense CISO threw together for a presentation that he does with very good presentation. I just stole one slide. But as I mentioned earlier, you need a combination of people, process, and technology. Without all 3 of them combined, you are not going to have an effective solution against those types of threats. With Target specifically, I would put them here. They had people, they didn't have process, and they had about half the technology. They were watching inbound, they were totally blind to outbound, and what happened is they had inconsistent operation. And that's exactly what happened in that type of scenario. And like I said, if you're interested, everything is annotated as far as all of the links, and my email address is down at the bottom. Thank you, everybody.